The moon hung low over the crumbling fortress of House Daldarin, its silver glow washing over the cold stone walls like a silent witness to treachery. Within the grand hall, flames flickered in iron sconces, casting elongated shadows over the assembled vampires. Predators draped in silk, their eyes gleaming with hunger. At the center of the chamber, Celine Duskbane stood, a vision of pale beauty, her long obsidian hair cascading like silk down her back. A silver collar, etched with ancient runes, coiled around her delicate throat, a mark of ownership that made her stomach churn. Her father, Lord Malric Duskbane, stood before her, his once magnificent form reduced to a desperate shell of a man. His fingers tightened around the parchment that sealed her fate. "Dorian Vane has paid handsomely," he murmured, his voice void of remorse. "This is the only way." Celine's silver eyes burned with quiet fury. "You are a coward," she whispered, her voice as sharp as broken glass. The crowd stirred, entertained by her defiance. Dorian Vane, her new master, lounged upon a throne of blackened bone, his lips curving in a cruel smile. "She has spirit, a rare thing," he mused, resting his fingers against his chin. "But she will learn obedience." As Celine clenched her fists, the heavy doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. A presence entered, one that sent a ripple of tension through the air. A beast in the shape of a man. Cale Ryder. He was dragged forward in chains, his massive frame barely restrained by the thick iron links. The guards flanking him were visibly uneasy, as if holding back a storm that could tear them apart at any moment. His presence was raw power, feral, untamed, dangerous. Dark, unkempt hair fell over his sharp, wolfish features, and his golden eyes burned like dying embers beneath a heavy brow. The scent of damp earth and blood clung to him, marking him as an outsider, a rogue werewolf captured and caged like an animal. Celine felt the shift in the room, the way every vampire stiffened at the sight of him. But Cal's gaze didn't sweep over them. It found her, and when it did, the air between them turned electric. His stare was not the emptied, defeated look of a broken man. It was a promise, a warning, and something else entirely. Dorian chuckled. "Impressive, isn't he? A beast with no master. He was caught trespassing on vampire lands, slaughtering my sentries. I thought perhaps we'd let him entertain us." A guard shoved Cal forward, and he barely moved, his lips curling into something that could have been amusement, or a threat. Celine should have ignored him. He was nothing but a pawn in their twisted games, another doomed soul in a house of horrors. But she could feel him watching her, like a predator scenting something forbidden. And God's help her, she felt something watching back. Dorian rose from his throne, eyes flicking between them before a wicked grin spread across his face. "Perhaps I should let my new pet break him in, a test of loyalty." The words were meant to humiliate, but Cale only tilted his head, his gaze still locked onto Celine. Then, without warning, he moved. Chains snapped, metal groaned, and before the guards could react, Cale lunged, not at them, but at her. The world blurred as Celine's breath caught. In a blink, he was upon her, his scent, smoke, earth, danger, flooding her senses. His body, all hard muscle and brutal strength, loomed over hers, caging her in without touching her. Yet she felt claimed all the same. A sharp inhale, a single, deliberate moment where his lips hovered near her ear. "You are not meant for this place," he murmured, his voice a dark growl, something rough and intimate meant only for her. "Run before it's too late." But Celine was no fragile thing. She met his piercing gaze and smiled, slow and wicked, and missed the show. His eyes darkened, something dangerous flaring within them. Then the room erupted into chaos. The dungeons beneath House Valdarin reeked of blood and damp stone, the air thick with the stench of suffering. Cal Ryder had been thrown into a cell barely large enough to contain his form, his wrists and ankles bound in iron shackles laced with silver. The metal burned against his skin, but he barely felt the pain. His senses were filled with something far more dangerous. Her. She stood on the other side of the bars, wrapped in the flickering torchlight like a phantom of the night. Celine Duskvein. She was unlike any vampire he had ever encountered, slender and regal, but with an edge of lethal grace, as if darkness itself had carved her from the moon's light. The silver collar still circled her delicate throat, marking her as property, but there was nothing submissive about the way she held herself. Cale let out a slow, deliberate breath. His instincts screamed to move, to rip apart the chains and take what was so dangerously near. She was an invitation to madness, ethereal, forbidden, and utterly intoxicating. Celine tilted her head, those silver eyes gleaming as she observed him. "You should be dead." A low, amused growl rumbled from his chest. "Disappointed I'm not." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the iron bars. "No, I expected you to survive." Cale smirked. She was playing the game, testing him. But she had no idea who she was toying with. His kind did not play by vampire rules. They took, conquered, devoured. He yanked against his chains, the force rattling the stone walls. Celine didn't flinch, but he saw the way her breath quickened, the way her pupils dilated just slightly. She wasn't afraid. She was intrigued. "What are you doing down here, little vampire?" he murmured, voice thick with something dark and dangerous. "Curious about the beast your master keeps in a cage." Celine leaned in, her lips curving in a slow, wicked smile. "Curious? No, I already know what you are." His gaze darkened. "And what's that?" "A storm waiting to break." Her words coiled around him, igniting something raw and primal in his chest. He shouldn't be drawn to her. She was a creature of shadow and deception, a daughter of the very monsters that had hunted his kind for centuries. But the way she stood before him, delicate yet deadly, untouchable yet so temptingly close, was unraveling his restraint one thread at a time. Cale stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You shouldn't be here. And yet, here I am." The silence between them crackled, thick with something unspoken, something undeniable. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Celine turned on her heel, her movements as smooth as silk. She paused at the cell door, glancing back. "I wonder, Cal Ryder, when the time comes, will you break free? Or will you let them tame you?" Cal's hands clenched, his body taut with barely leashed power. His golden eyes burned into hers. "They can try," he growled. "But I am no one's pet." Celine's smile was slow, knowing. Then, without another word, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Cale alone in the dark, the scent of her still lingering in the air, a haunting promise, a dangerous temptation. And for the first time since his capture, he felt something other than rage. He felt hunger. The night air was thick with the scent of death and smoke. Shadows stretched long across the desolate corridors of House Valdorin, the distant echoes of screams fading into the abyss. The fortress was crumbling from within. Cal Ryder had broken free. Blood dripped from his knuckles, his breath ragged, muscles coiled with violent energy. Chains lay shattered at his feet, the bodies of his captors strewn across the cold stone like discarded puppets. The beast within him howled for more, but his golden eyes searched for only one thing. Celine. He found her moments later, bound, surrounded by guards in the great hall where she had been sold like an object. The sight of her, pale wrists chained, silver eyes burning with defiance, unleashed something primal in him. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. "Touch her," Cale warned, his voice dark as a coming storm, "and I'll rip your throats out." The vampires hesitated. Even creatures of the night knew better than to challenge a rogue werewolf at his peak. Celine met his gaze, unshaken by his fury. Her lips, full and untouched by fear, curved into something almost teasing. "Took you long enough." Cale smirked, but there was nothing playful in it. He moved before the guards could react, a blur of muscle and rage. Claws tore through flesh, bones cracked beneath his hands. In mere seconds, The once powerful enforcers lay lifeless at his feet, their crimson staining the marble floor. The silver collar around Celine's throat gleamed in the flickering torchlight. He reached for it, fingers brushing against the cold metal. She inhaled sharply at the contact, but didn't pull away. Cal's voice was a rough whisper. "Hold still." With a savage jerk, he broke the collar apart. The ancient enchantments sizzled as they shattered, releasing Celine from her bonds. She let out a breath, rolling her shoulders as the weight of enslavement fell away. Their eyes met. Something changed. For the first time, there was nothing between them. No chains, no power struggles, no walls. Only them, standing in the ruins of a world that had tried to break them both. Celine tilted her head, watching him with a strange softness. "You could have left me." Cal stepped closer, his scent, earth, steel, wild fury, flooding her senses. "I don't leave what's mine." A sharp intake of breath. The words hung between them, heavy, unshakable. Celine was not weak. She was not something to be claimed, owned, or protected. Yet when he said it, there was no threat in his voice, only certainty. A slow, wicked smile played at her lips. "Is that what I am?" Cal reached out, his fingers ghosting over the delicate curve of her jaw. The contrast between them, his callous touch against her cold, silken skin, sent a shiver through them both. "Run with me," he murmured, his golden eyes locked onto hers. "Before they come." Celine glanced at the bodies around them, the distant roar of more enemies approaching. Freedom was so close. She looked back at Cal, at the beast who had chosen her over vengeance. A vampire and a werewolf. A mistake waiting to happen. But God's help her. She wanted it. With a swift nod, she took his outstretched hand. And together, they disappeared into the night, chased by the ghosts of a world that would never accept them. The wind howled through the dense blackthorn forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Moonlight barely touched the ground beneath the towering trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a lone wolf shattered the silence. Cal Ryder moved like a shadow through the woods, Celine Duskbane in his wake. They had run for hours, slipping past their hunters, the scent of blood and death still clinging to them. Celine was fast, but Cal was relentless. Even in her vampire form, she had to push herself to keep up with him. The raw power in his every stride was mesmerizing. Feral, untamed, utterly unstoppable. Now, deep within the heart of the wilderness, he finally stopped. Celine leaned against a tree, her breath coming in slow, controlled inhales, though exhaustion curled at the edges of her body. The forest was eerily silent, as if the world itself feared the beast standing before her. Cal's golden eyes flicked to her, burning in the darkness. "You're slowing down." His voice was rough, edged with something unreadable. Celine smirked, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "And you're impatient." Cal stepped toward her, closing the space between them in an instant. She felt the warmth of his body, the heat radiating from his skin, so different from her own unnatural cold. His presence was commanding, his sheer dominance pressing against her senses like a force of nature. "You weren't made for this," he murmured, his voice thick as the night air. "For running. For the wild." Celine arched a brow, unbothered by his proximity. "And yet I'm here." Cal let out a low, dark chuckle. Barely. She should have been irritated. But instead, a dangerous heat flickered in her chest. The way he looked at her, like a creature resisting the urge to devour something forbidden, sent a slow thrill down her spine. Her fingers ghosted over his wrist, barely touching, but enough for a wicked curiosity to spark in his gaze. "You think I'm fragile," she mused. Cal's jaw clenched. His body was wound tight, like he was holding himself back from something he couldn't name. "No," he admitted. "I think you're dangerous." Celine's lips curved into a slow smile. "Then why do you keep coming closer?" He was close now. Too close. The space between them had vanished, and for the first time, she realized just how much she could feel him. The way his breath brushed against her skin, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, aching to touch. The wild scent of him, smoke, steel, and something untamed, wrapped around her, dragging her deeper into the storm that was Kale Ryder. His eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second. It was a mistake. Celine tilted her head, her voice a soft whisper against the air. "Careful, Wolf. You might start to like me." Cal's expression darkened. His hand shot out, pressing flat against the tree beside her head, caging her in without touching her. "I already do," he growled. The words sent a sharp, thrilling ache through her. She should have pulled away. She should have taunted him, broken the moment before it consumed them both. But neither of them moved. The world had gone still, the tension between them thick as the midnight sky. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No war, no enemies, no blood. Only them. Then a branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Cal's head jerked up, his body shifting in an instant from hunter to protector. "They're coming." Celine exhaled, forcing herself to step away from the gravity of him. "Then we better keep running." Cale nodded once, but as they vanished into the night, the hunger in his gaze never left her. The cave was hidden deep within the mountains, shielded by jagged cliffs and thick mist. A stream ran through the stone, its soft murmuring the only sound in the stillness. Firelight flickered against the damp walls, casting golden shadows that danced like restless spirits. Kale Ryder paced near the entrance, his body restless, his instincts on fire. He could still feel her. Celine. She sat near the flames, her long dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her pale skin bathed in the golden glow. The fire made her look almost human, almost warm. But Kale knew better. She was something unnatural, intoxicating, dangerous. And she was inside his den. Kale exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his thick hair. His skin still burned from the closeness of her, from the way her scent, night-blooming jasmine and blood, had tangled itself into his lungs. It had been a mistake, bringing her here, but the moment he had seen her falter, just slightly, he hadn't been able to stop himself. "You're staring, Wolf." Her voice was soft but sharp, like the edge of a blade hidden in silk. Cale's golden eyes met hers. "You're in my territory. You should expect it." Celine smirked, stretching her legs in a slow, deliberate motion. She looked utterly at ease, as if she belonged here, as if she hadn't spent centuries among creatures that hunted his kind. "And what happens," she murmured, tilting her head, "when a vampire enters the den of a beast?" Kale let out a low growl, stepping forward. "Depends on the vampire." Celine's silver eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "And me." He stopped just inches away, the firelight reflecting off his sharp features. "I haven't decided yet." The space between them was thick, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. He should have pulled back, should have put more distance between them, but the pull of her was undeniable. Cal's gaze dropped to her lips. A mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. Celine noticed. She always noticed. "You're fighting it." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Why?" Kale clenched his jaw. Because she was wrong. Because he wasn't fighting it. He was losing. Everything about her was designed to ensnare, to pull him into the dark, to make him forget what he was. She wasn't meant for this world of fire and hunger, and yet she was so perfectly dangerous in it. He reached out before he could stop himself. His fingers brushed against her wrist, his skin burning from the unnatural cold of hers. She inhaled softly, barely noticeable, but enough for him to hear it. Enough for him to know she felt this too. Cal's voice was rough, barely controlled. "You don't belong here." Celine's lips parted slightly, her silver gaze locking onto his. "And yet, you keep me close." Damn her. He should have pulled away. He should have ignored the way her voice slid over him like a whispered spell. But his fingers curled around her wrist instead. anchoring her to the moment. Celine tilted her head, her breath feathering against his skin. "You're warm," she murmured. "I wonder what that feels like." Cale let out a slow exhale, his grip tightening. His heart thundered in his chest, his instincts screaming at him. This was madness. This was impossible. This was wrong. But God's help him, he wanted to show her. His other hand came up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. She didn't flinch, didn't move. She just watched him, like a predator patiently waiting for him to break. And he would. Soon, a storm raged outside, the wind howling through the mountain peaks. But inside the cave, the air was thick with something far more dangerous. Cale stood at the entrance, muscles coiled, fists clenched at his sides. He should have left, should have put miles between himself and the vampire who sat by the fire, watching him with that knowing, infuriating gaze. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. Celine lay stretched against a fur blanket, her dark lashes casting shadows over her pale, flawless skin. Her silver eyes gleamed in the firelight, tracing over him with slow, deliberate intent. "You're restless," she observed, voice smooth as silk. Cale let out a sharp breath, his golden eyes burning. "You're enjoying this too much." Celine's lips curled in a slow, wicked smile. What part, exactly? Damn her. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every word, every slight movement, was designed to pull him deeper into the fire. He strode toward her, his presence commanding, his body radiating heat and raw, untamed power. He stopped just short of her, looming like a storm ready to break. "You think this is a game," he growled. Celine arched a delicate brow, unshaken. "Everything is a game, Wolf. You just don't know the rules yet." Cale's jaw clenched. His instincts screamed to act, to seize control of the situation, to remind her exactly who he was, what he was. But Celine was no fragile thing. She was a creature of the night, as dangerous as she was beautiful, and she was playing with fire just as much as he was. She shifted slightly, just enough for the firelight to kiss the delicate curve of her throat. "Tell me, Cale," she whispered, her voice laced with dark amusement. "Are you afraid?" His eyes locked onto hers, molten gold meeting silver. He crouched before her, his presence overwhelming, his heat pressing into the cold space between them. "Afraid?" His voice was rough, edged with something untamed. "No, but you should be." Celine inhaled softly, so soft he almost missed it. Almost. Cale smirked. "Your heart doesn't beat, but I can hear the way your breath catches when I get close." She tilted her head, unbothered. "And yet, you're the one gripping the earth like you need to hold yourself back." His hands flexed against the stone. She was right. He was holding back, barely. Every instinct in his body told him to claim, to conquer, to pull her into the heat of him until she forgot the cold of death. Celine's fingers ghosted near his, not quite touching, but close enough to feel. "Why do you fight it?" she whispered. Cale let out a low growl. "Because once I stop." She leaned in, her breath feathering against his skin, so dangerously close. "Then stop." The words shattered the last thread of his restraint. In one swift motion, he had her caged beneath him. The fire flickered wildly, casting their shadows against the walls, twisting together as if mirroring the storm between them. Cale's breath was heavy, his body tense with barely controlled hunger. Celine lay beneath him, unafraid, entirely intoxicating. Her silver eyes gleamed, her lips slightly parted, not in fear, but in challenge. Cale's fingers traced the line of her jaw, his touch rough, possessive. "You really don't know what you're asking for," he murmured. Celine's lips curved, a whisper of a smile. "And you don't know what you're denying yourself." A muscle in his jaw ticked. The truth of her words burned. But before he could respond, a sound outside sent his instincts flaring. Movement. A presence. Cale was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his golden eyes flashing with the promise of violence. Celine rose slowly, brushing dust from her gown, unbothered. "It seems we have company." Cale glanced at her over his shoulder. Even now, she looked calm, unreadable, but he saw the glint in her eyes, the same hunger that burned in him. He let out a slow exhale, rolling his shoulders. They had unfinished business, but first, they had prey to deal with. The night pulsed with danger. Cale stood at the mouth of the cave, his golden eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows beyond the storm-soaked trees. The scent of intruders thickened the air. Wolves, but not his. Hunters. Killers. Celine emerged beside him, her presence as silent as mist. The firelight behind them flickered against her porcelain skin, casting an ethereal glow around her. She was too still, too cold, too perfect. A creature made for darkness. "They found us," she murmured, her silver eyes glinting like liquid metal. Cale flexed his hands, his body humming with the need for violence. For destruction. Then let them come. Celine tilted her head, studying him. "You want the fight." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A slow, wicked smile touched her lips. "Good." A sharp rustle in the undergrowth. Then a figure lunged from the shadows. A rogue werewolf, eyes wild, teeth bared. Cale moved before Celine could, his body a blur of raw power as he caught the attacker midair. Bones cracked. A snarl. A cut-off scream. Cale slammed the body into the earth, his claws sinking into flesh. Blood sprayed across the rocks, steaming against the cold night air. Celine watched with quiet amusement. Brutal. Cale rose, chest heaving, blood dripping from his fingers. He turned to her, something feral still burning in his gaze. "You disapprove." Celine stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the unnatural chill of her presence. "No," she whispered. "I think I rather enjoy watching you like this." Cale growled low in his throat. She was testing him again. Pushing. Tempting. Before he could respond, another attacker charged from the trees. Celine moved like a ghost. One moment she was still. The next, she was behind the wolf, a whisper of movement, inhuman, hypnotic. The rogue barely had time to turn before her fingers brushed his throat. Not claws, not brute strength, just the lightest, softest touch. Then she struck. A flash of silver. A whisper of steel. The rogue choked, eyes wide, clutching his throat as blood poured between his fingers. Celine stepped back, watching him collapse at her feet with detached elegance. She turned to Cale, her silver gaze unreadable. "You kill like a beast," she mused. "I kill like a shadow." Cale's breathing was heavy, his pulse a wild drumbeat beneath his skin. The sight of her, deadly, graceful, utterly intoxicating, set his blood on fire. He closed the space between them in 2 strides. Celine didn't move as he loomed over her, his heat pressing against her cold. Fire and ice. Opposites. Enemies. But in this moment, she wasn't pushing him away. She was waiting. Cale's fingers brushed against her jaw, his touch rough, possessive. This woman, this creature, she was everything he should hate, everything his instincts warned him against. But God's help him, he wanted her. Celine's lips parted slightly, her breath cool against his skin. Unshaken, unafraid, entirely alluring. His thumb traced the curve of her throat, where a human's pulse would race. She had no heartbeat, but she was alive in other ways. In the sharp gleam of her eyes, in the way her body remained so still yet crackled with hidden power. Cale's voice was low, edged with something dark. "One day, you'll stop playing games." Celine's smile was slow, wicked. "And what will you do when I do?" His grip tightened, just slightly. Enough to make her notice. Enough to make her breath hitch. Cale leaned in, his mouth close to her ear. "You'll find out." Before she could respond, a final distant growl echoed through the night. The remaining rogues had fled, leaving only the storm and the blood-soaked ground behind. The battle was over. But the war between them, it was only beginning. The night had settled into a heavy silence. The air, thick with the scent of rain and blood, clung to them both. The storm had passed, but the tension between them had not. Cale stood at the edge of the cave, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each deep breath. He had fought. He had killed. And yet, the hunger burning inside him had nothing to do with battle. It was her. Celine moved like a wraith behind him, her steps silent, her presence colder than the wind that swept through the trees. She had watched him tear through their enemies, had seen the violence in his golden eyes, and yet there was no fear in her. Only intrigue, only something dark and wicked curling at the corners of her perfect lips. Cale turned, his gaze locking onto her. "You enjoy that," he said, voice low and rough. Celine tilted her head, silver eyes gleaming. "So did you." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't enjoy killing my own kind." She stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "No," she murmured, "but you enjoyed fighting for me." Cale stilled, his jaw clenched. Damn her. She could see through him too easily. Celine reached out, the tips of her fingers barely grazing his arm. A whisper of contact. A cold kiss against his burning skin. He should have pulled away. Should have ignored the way her presence made his pulse thunder. But instead, he turned to her fully, closing the space between them in a single predatory step. "You think you know me," he murmured. Celine's lips curved slightly. "I do." His fingers brushed against her throat, rough and unyielding. A werewolf's touch, a beast's claim. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into it. Cale let out a slow breath, his grip tightening just slightly. "You're playing a dangerous game, vampire." Celine lifted her chin, her silver gaze defiant. "So are you." The firelight flickered between them, their shadows stretching and merging against the walls of the cave. His golden eyes traced over her, from the sharp line of her jaw to the curve of her lips, a mouth made for sin, for secrets, for whispered destruction. "Why do you stay?" he asked, voice rough. Celine studied him, silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, she placed her hand over his, not pushing him away, holding him there. "Because you don't scare me," she whispered, "and because you want me to stay." Cale's control snapped like a frayed thread. In a single fluid motion, he had her pinned against the cave wall, his body pressing against hers, his heat burning into her cold skin. Celine did not resist. If anything, she welcomed it. She looked up at him, her silver eyes blazing, her lips parted, not in fear, but in challenge. "You should run from me," Cale growled, his breath hot against her throat. Celine smirked. "Then why are you the one chasing?" His grip tightened, his body thrumming with the need to claim, to consume, to destroy and worship all at once. Celine lifted a hand, fingers trailing through his dark hair, her touch cold fire against his burning skin. "You fight it," she whispered, "but you forget. Cal, you're mine now too." His pulse slammed into his ribs, a wild, untamed rhythm. He should have denied it, should have fought against the truth in her words. But instead, he growled low in his throat, his lips costing against the curve of her jaw. "Say it." Celine exhaled, soft and slow. Then, against the silence of the night, she whispered, "You are mine." Cale crushed his mouth to hers, the storm inside them finally breaking. And this time, neither of them held back.